Yes.
Okay. I'm going to introduce Debbie today. Debbie's our speaker. She's with the Northern Ireland Alternatives. That's a government accredited community restorative justice organization in Northern Ireland. And she's been with the organization for over 15 years. She's a restorative practitioner as well as a lawyer with a legal background. And we chatted earlier this week. She was telling me about their program and how they've integrated within the legal community and also within the community, and how they've been able to get buy-in from the various people that both help their program and also come to use their services. So thank you, Debbie, for taking the time. I know it's in the evening on a Friday evening where you are, and we really appreciate having you here with us today.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much. And welcome everybody. I have a colleague who's from Waco in Texas. So I've got to tell you, the Texas accent, I absolutely love the Texas accent. I've enjoyed listening to many stories and tales from her. So this evening I don't plan on giving anything in terms of like a PowerPoint presentation or anything like that. I'm going to give an overview of alternatives and how we started, and some of the context around the restorative journey that we've had, particularly within the framework of a conflict and legacy background here for, I'm sure that most of you have heard or know of in terms of the troubles and the conflict that we had here in Northern Ireland. And this essentially is where our practice has evolved from. And then I'm going to speak a bit about some of the logistics around some of the mediations and some of the processes that we get involved in, and speak a little bit around neutrality and how we manage that, and when we sometimes actually in situations where we don't mind if that's actually an aspect that's maybe set aside, but I'll give examples around that as well. And then chat about some self-care and what we do as practitioners in terms of keeping ourselves well looked after, because this is a heavy game sometimes that we're involved in. And we just want to make sure that there's a lot of self-love and self-care out there, that not only we're wrapping around the people that we're working with and providing a service with, but also that we're doing for ourselves and we're doing for our colleagues. And feel free, I'm quite happy that this is very free-flowing. So anybody who wants to ask questions, interrupt me, please do. I don't have the ability to see every single person on the screen while I'm speaking here at the moment, so please just ask, and I'll be happy to answer. Does that sound okay? Does that sound, yeah, happy enough? Good stuff. Okay, so Northern Ireland Alternatives, we were established in 1998 following the ceasefires in Northern Ireland in 1994. So we had a 30-year legacy of a conflict that was happening here from 1969, essentially, when the major attacks and bombings and shootings were being brought within a civilian context here. And we had a number of ceasefires up until then, but to be honest with you, they were largely tokenistic. So in 1994, we had ceasefires from the two main combatants, the two main paramilitary groupings that would have been very active at that time. But what we found was, even though communities themselves were trying to navigate and come out of what was a very difficult period, that could never happen overnight. Going from conflict into peace, we're still on that journey. But in those early days in 1994, right through to 95, 96, 97, we actually saw an increase in what is termed as paramilitary summary justice. And what we mean by that is that communities that had spent so long within the conflict, essentially policing themselves, and how that was done was through summary justice. So it was shootings, beatings, and community exclusions of people that were deemed to be unsavory or unwanted, or people that had been involved in difficult behaviour. Primarily, I do want to state that primarily at that stage, this was young people that we're talking about. So this was young people that we classed to be under the age of 25, who were at most at risk of living within their own areas and their own communities. So we were set up as an organisation to help combat that. So Debbie Waters, who's the director of Northern Ireland Alternatives, had actually been working out in America and had been working out in Michigan and had developed or had worked within this realm of restorative justice. And when she came back to Northern Ireland and back to Belfast in particular, she thought, actually, here's a model that could be working here, because some of this work is actually already happening. Our other director, Tom Winston, had been involved in a research project, and the two of them got together and thought, okay, we actually think that we could be making a difference here within our communities to make them safer, to make sure that they're more welcoming for people. And primarily, we want to make sure that we're trying to secure the physical safety of people that are living within those areas. So our mediation journey comes from that. It comes from that really dark history. Even though we're moving into, peace times, for example, but I think it's important to highlight that that is the context from within we were starting. So it was really challenging, a really challenging time. And at that point, because of the nature, and because given the difficulties around working with former combatants, if you like, the government had an embargo on us. So as an organisation, we actually at that stage couldn't apply for funding. Now, we had relationships working with the police and particular people within the legal sphere here, but we weren't included within the legal framework, completely different for us. And we actually were funded by American philanthropic organisation for 10 years, whilst we did not receive local government funding here. And that organisation is called Atlantic Philanthropies. There were still, until they sort of went there, they were a huge advocate of us and a huge advocate of our work. So for any of you that don't know, our peace accord was made up from representatives from the Irish government, from the British government, and from America. So we had Senator George Mitchell, who was party to those peace talks and a signatory of our peace agreement. So it's lovely to be speaking with a group of Americans, given our background and our history, and the fact actually that we would not be here and I wouldn't be speaking with you today had we not have had the backing from an American organisation. So thank you. We have moved on from that, and the level of the work has increased from there. And in terms of the mediation work that we are involved in, it can be anything in terms of low-level neighbourhood disputes, right through to larger disputes that will involve state actors and the local community. And what I mean by that will still be people that have been connected to the conflict in the past, and for example, with the police as well. That, I hope, just sort of gives you a bit of a breadth in terms of the nature, and we cover everything in between, everything in between. So we've about 50 members of staff. The staff come from a huge range, huge background. So we have people with legal backgrounds, social workers, teachers, people with community development, youth workers, which is an essential part of our role and what we do. Yeah, and that wealth of knowledge. And we also have volunteers, and we've had people who've been participants in programs that we've actually trained and developed, and they're now part of the staffing team. Okay. Does anybody have any questions or comments at this point? If you do, just speak out loud. I'm flicking through the screen. No? Belinda?
Yes. What was the name of the philanthropy group that you mentioned that funded you?
Atlantic Philanthropies.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Okay. So in terms then of Is it useful for people then if I maybe just give a couple of examples maybe about some of the mediations that we've been involved in?
Yes.
Does that work? Yeah. Okay. Cool. So in terms of, and I am gonna sort of focus on more of the cases around the sensitive and complex. So in terms of migration and immigration here in Northern Ireland, it has greatly increased over the last, I'm going to say 25 years, but definitely more concentrated within the last 14, 15 years. We have had different communities that have settled here over the years, but given during the conflict, we were probably not, it wasn't that inviting for people to want to come and settle here. But since 1998 and onwards, and the European Union, etc., and how it works, we have seen an increase. And unfortunately, with that comes the negative aspects. So we currently receive funding through a government statutory body called the Housing Executive. And that is to work with victims and I'm going to say harmers of hate crime. It might be useful at this stage in terms of the language that I use. When we first started, we would have used the terms victim, offender, and community. So we would have used the traditional kind of restorative triangle. But I'm sure most of you will be aware that most often, actually, people that are deemed as being perpetrators or harmers can actually be victims as well. And they can be victims within the same scenario or the same situation. So we've consciously changed our language around that because we just don't feel that it's helpful or it's useful. Even in circumstances, for example, where it is very, very clear that one person is a victim and one person is a perpetrator or an offender. But given the fact that we are voluntary, we ask for voluntary participation in terms of our processes. If you're labeling somebody as being an offender, it's not that inviting for them to get involved in the process because automatically you're making a judgment. Okay, and that's the one thing that we're not looking to do. We look at the behavior and the actions of somebody as opposed to the person themselves. So I'll refer to harmer and harmed party, and I hope that resonates with people. So in terms of the hate crime cases, for example, around that, a lot of the work that we do in this week will be co-working. It will be co-working with interpreters to make sure that they've got the nuances. Quite often it'll involve co-working with the police as well. Even if there is going to be a criminal case that's going to be put forward to our local prosecution service, we can still be involved in that case. Some mediation services would opt out at that point because they would think if there's going to be a criminal investigation or a criminal process, why do you need mediation? Okay, why is a mediator involved if this is going down a legal route? So as somebody with a legal background, I'm saying, and as an organisation, we say mediation is still crucial at this point because people are still living within the communities that they've been harmed in. So if somebody is living in a house and it's in a street and they have been attacked or hurt or harmed by somebody that's living relatively within their community, regardless of whether there's a legal process that's going to happen down the line, it's going to take a while to get there, which is the first thing to consider. And secondly, to consider those people are still living relatively within the same proximity. They could still come into contact with each other. They could still pass each other because not all of the cases will involve an exclusion. So people will still be required to live within that sort of same area, still be part of the same community. And we feel that it's vital then that if a mediation process can take place, to just keep the ground going, just to settle everything, particularly settle emotions, then we will be involved in that. Providing it's helpful. We're moving away as well from the language of risk assessments when we're engaging in a mediation process, and we're using more the term of a safety plan. And the reason why we talk in terms of safety, I'll explain to you. we have what's called a 15-minute manifesto. So when a case comes into the organisation and we're required to co-work it with somebody, whether that be internally or externally, we have a conversation with the co-worker, and the conversation goes like this. And it is, what do I need to do? Okay. How do I want to feel as being part of this process? And I'll give 3 words. And they'll tend to be, I want to feel safe as a practitioner. I want to feel heard as well. And I want to feel valued, that I'm in a process that's adding something. My co-worker answers the same questions. Okay. Then again, I'm asked, well, how do I want my co-worker to feel being involved in this process with me? Quite often the words you'll have an overlap in words. So it will be, I want them to feel valued. I want them to feel that they're making a contribution, and I want them to feel protected, for example. My co-worker then will answer the same 3 questions and the same question, and we'll see if there's a collaboration or there's a crossover in terms of words. And then thirdly, I will answer the question on behalf of the participants that are engaging in the mediation. How do I want these participants to feel, or how do I want them to be in this process? Quite often then the same thing, I want them to feel safe. I want them to feel heard. I want them to feel included, valued, whatever terminology. And then my co-worker does the same. Based on those words and those conversations that we're having, that's what our safety plan is built on. That's what we're centering it on. And then when we're meeting with the parties that are involved, we'll have the same conversations with them. So we're open in terms of, what do I want to get out of this process as a practitioner? What can I bring to the process? Same for my co-worker, my colleagues, or an external party. And then we'll have that same conversation then with the participants that are going to be involved in it. Does that make sense? Yeah. And we think that that's a really good foundation for, I think, just in terms of moving forward. So people get a good sense of they're entering into a voluntary process, and they know that we're committed to making sure that their safety, their emotional safety, is as best as we can actually make it. Personal safety is a different thing, because if we felt that there was a personal risk, we wouldn't bring them into, it would be a shuttle mediation where the parties, the conversations are happening and we're acting as a conduit going backwards and forth. But where it's a face-to-face mediation, we make sure that process, we're sort of going through those questions, right up until and during and after the mediation process has begun. We've been doing the follow-up then with it. An example of when, so I've mentioned there about hate crime, for example. So I'm sort of going back to some of the considerations then around that. So we're looking at religious considerations, ethnicity considerations, other cases that we're looking at, we're checking to make sure if there's anything around mental health, neurodiversity, any complex sensitivities that we need to be aware of, because at this stage, we're only privy to information that people are actually openly sharing with us. And initially, when we're starting to engage with people, and I'm sure you as a cohort of mediators have experienced the same thing, is that people very rarely come and give you all the information that you need at once. You kind of get drip fed it, and it comes out through trust and through conversations and building relationships with them. So quite often you're having to adapt that as you go along, because you need to make sure then that you're that you're protecting them, but you're also giving them enough agency where they're making those decisions themselves. And that they're not entering into a process, obviously, where they're being re-traumatized or they're being re-victimized. One of the key things that we have here, again connected to the conflict, will be around people will still be excluded from communities here. They'll still find themselves at risk, and it can come with immediacy. It can literally be a phone call to say, Debbie, this person living at this address is under threat. And when that call comes through, it means they're under threat from physical harm and or damage to their property or to their home. Sometimes at this stage, an attack on their home might already have happened, and we're actually brought in at that stage then to see how we can minimize or reduce the risk. And in cases like that, they're top priority. So whatever else is happening, they just go to the top of the list. And that will be a sequence of events then, one in terms of the level of confidentiality around the mediation and around the people that are being spoken with and the people that are being involved. Because in cases like this, it will only ever be senior managers and the mediators that are involved in the process. This information will not be shared at all. Where there's a high risk that's involved, and it will only ever be a shuttle mediation. The information around these types of cases will be done in person because the information is too sensitive to be done over email and to be done over telephone as well. So any I suppose clarification around these types of cases will be done in person and in person only. And that is in terms of liaising with people within the community around the type of risk, the immediacy of the risk, what the exclusion area of the risk involves. And then that information then is relayed to the other party. So like with most mediations, when you're connecting or you're speaking with one party, we always ask, we use a method called the blue line, red line. And I'll say, while we're chatting today, just enable the conversation to be really free flowing. And I want them to have a free flow of conversation with me, but I also want them to highlight to me during the conversation what information they do not want me to share. And we do that by the blue lines and the red lines. So if we're having a conversation and the person simply puts their hand onto the blue line card, I know that they're free flowing, they're talking, and there's parts of that conversation I can relay to the other party. If they're touching or they're referring to the red line card, I know that the information that they're currently sharing with me, they don't want that shared, but they're giving that information to me by way of context, or because we're still in that process of building a relationship and they feel comfortable enough that they're sharing it with me. So it is absolutely vitally important then that whenever I'm making notes and I'm writing up details with regards to the case, that I clarify afterwards at the end of the conversation, that I clarify and say, look, can we just spend 10 minutes here and go over parts of the conversation and the detail that you do not want me to mention. It could be a health issue. It could be a specific impact of the event that person doesn't want me to share because they feel really vulnerable, and they don't want the other person to know that their actions have had this effect on them, and that's really understandable. So there's a lot of time that is spent in making sure that that is the case. Okay.
Debbie, what percentage of mediations are conducted remote versus in person?
I would say probably about 60-40 remote. About 60-40 remote. And in that 40% where I'm saying face-to-face, quite a lot of those actually would be family mediations that we would do. And they tend to be more around like mental health issues, for example, or conflict with a young person. Okay. Any other questions so far? Okay. So an example just that I want to give you around sort of challenging cases that have came through as a practitioner. I'm going to give a really heartfelt example about 6 or 7 years ago. I had a case from a lady. She made contact with the office and she was very distressed on the phone. And what information I could get from her was that her neighbour had erected a shed. This was a neighbour who was 2 doors up, had erected a shed on the back of their garden. And this lady was phoning to say that she was she was just completely distracted by this because the shed was obstructing her dog's view. Okay. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, has that lady just said to me that her dog's view is being obstructed, not her view? So chatted a bit more, etc. And she said, yes, the shed is obstructing my dog's view. And I thought, okay. And the reason why I'm saying this to you is because in an instant like that, I'm human, but I'm automatically thinking, a dog's view is being obstructed? Like, obstructed from what? But I have to completely validate that lady's feelings. That lady phoned me in a really distressed, state. And it was all I could do to calm her down. So then the day after, myself and a colleague went out to the house and we chatted with her, etc. And she was still saying the same thing. She brought us out, the dog, we saw the shed, etc. But it was really clear that there were other issues going on there for this lady. This was the straw that was breaking the camel's back, and that there had been a history, not only between the neighbours, but actually the dispute went back further than that, that it actually involved previous family members. And then through conversations with the lady, etc., over a couple of weeks, there were mental health issues there. But that did not take away from the fact that this lady wanted me to highlight to her neighbour the issues that she was facing. So I use that as an example because sometimes, the phone rings and we don't know what we're answering. We don't know what somebody's asking us to respond to. But it is absolutely paramount that that lady was treated in exactly the same manner as if somebody was phoning me to say that their house had been burgled by somebody. Because the distress levels arguably were the same. And her feelings were completely relevant, and it was all we could do to validate those. I'm just sort of conscious of time now, we're at 6:30. Is there any burning questions in terms of logistics? Does anybody want me to sort of go through some of the finer detail around logistics about bringing people together, or are you guys?
I have one. Yes, just one quick question. Here in Texas, confidentiality is also very important, but we do have some exceptions. And I'm wondering if in your mediations you have any exceptions to confidentiality.
Absolutely, that's a great question. Thank you. We do. So first and foremost, if a person is at risk of harming themselves or others, we must disclose that information. So that information would be disclosed to the police if we felt that it was a physical harm. It could be disclosed, if it's a young person, it could be disclosed to a family member, for example, or an appropriate adult. So whoever the guardian is for that young person, or a parent, for example. Or if one of the strange things around it as well is that, so when someone's engaging in the mediation process with us, we do have a pro forma that states on it, when you're engaged in the process with us, we might have to share information with other parties and co-workers. So that for us could be the police, social services, some housing providers or landlords. It could be social services. It could be what's called here our Belfast City Council, so our councillors, for example, but only because they might be aware of the situation as well, and we're just liaising with them just to make sure that we're not duplicating services, or that we're providing a coordinated approach as opposed to it's piecemeal and it's a bit sort of staggered, and the participants really don't know where they are in the process. But and if people don't sign that, or they say we're happy for you to share the information with the police, but no other services. It depends on the situation. Another one actually, would be probation. So if we're working with somebody who's out on probation or on license, it might be necessary to contact probation services.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. So in terms of neutrality, And neutrality is always, people ask us about this all the time. And because we are working as mediators, we're working as mediators within a restorative practice field. So any mediation training that I have done, and I actually train people as well, is this notion around neutrality and how do we ensure that we remain neutral. And I'm just going to say outright, I think it's really difficult to ensure. And it's really difficult to ensure because we are human. Okay, and we're involved in people's lives, and we're in this work, but we're in this work because we want to make a difference. We want to help people. We want to ensure that people, you know, are better off when they're leaving us than what they were when they met us. That they're a bit safer when they're leaving us than when they met us. And that's quite difficult to do, because we all have emotions and we all have triggers, and we've all been in situations ourselves. We think, okay, but the level of neutrality for us would be that it's not a family member, that it's not a close friend, or it's not somebody that we have that sort of instant emotional contact with. But a caveat to that would be, I live and work within the community that I serve and I support. So I could be out doing my shopping and somebody could come up to me and say, did you hear such and such? Did you hear about this? Can I come and speak to you about it? And I'll say, of course. And by the time I've got home, I've had a text message from somebody saying, did you hear about such and such? Can I come and speak to you about it? And I'll say, yes, of course you can. So in terms of ensuring the level of neutrality there, I'm not there to help facilitate what their outcomes or their agreements are as to how they move forward. I'm there to facilitate the conversation that they're having. So that keeps me neutral. That in essence itself keeps me neutral, provided I'm not providing the answers to what their concerns are. Quite happy to have the chats around it, and if ideas pop into their heads, that's a different matter. But because we're not setting up, here's what you should do, then as a mediator, I'm still remaining as neutral as I possibly can. I'm not sure as mediators and practitioners that you agree with that. It's been part of how we have managed to establish ourselves and actually to build up the credibility and the reputation of Northern Ireland Alternatives. Is the fact that actually the majority of the people that contact us will make contact either because they walk past the office, we're in the neighbourhood, somebody has recommended them, they've heard that we've been involved in something else before. And because we do a lot of other pieces of work and we're not just providing a mediative service, we do prevention work and lots of different program activity, a lot of community safety and good relations work. And sometimes it's just a conversation with people that will say, oh, actually, I didn't know that you did that, but I've got a problem here. Or it could come completely anonymous, where the neutrality then is it's already there. Does that make sense? Is there anybody that thinks differently around that? Because this usually comes up as being a topic of debate around neutrality with mediators.
I'll say something.
Walter.
I think there's not much that I'm neutral about, okay? I'm an opinionated person, but the way I see it is that when I'm in mediation, I don't have any stake in the outcome. And I tell myself, in my case, I never really know the people. Sometimes I know their lawyers, but I don't know the people and I wasn't there. So I think that's what helps me. I oftentimes am not neutral at all about the subject matter of the dispute, but partial about the outcome and just not judging them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is so hard. You know, it's hard to live a life and it's hard to work within these realms without being affected in some shape or form, even if it's not directly, but indirectly. So we would use the language in terms of if I go back and sort of say harmed parties or victims as being direct, secondary, and tertiary. I'm not sure if you guys use the same language as that, but you know, we're always coming across people that either, if it's not direct, it's secondary removed, or it's a wider community that can be affected by that. Okay. So I'll move on then, and I'll talk a bit about self-care. Okay, does that work, Maricela? Are you happy enough?
I do have a question.
Oh, yeah.
Are attorneys involved in a lot of these mediations, and do you get a lot of your cases referred from the court, or these self-referrals, or how do you get your
Okay,
participants?
great question. So in terms of young people, so it's quite distinctive here. So if a young person commits an offence, so the criminal age of responsibility here is 10. Okay, so we've one of the lowest. Currently campaigning to have that actually significantly increased, but at the minute it's 10. So if you commit an offence here and you're aged 10 to 17, you know, and 364 days, you are referred to what's called Youth Justice Agency here. And as part of the Youth Justice Agency, providing you have not committed, you know, a case of murder or I'm going to say manslaughter, but you can still have a conference if you've committed GBH, grievous bodily harm here. Okay. You have to be offered a case conference around that. And that will be made up of people from the community. So, for example, it could be me. It could be, there's no lawyers actually, sorry, I must say. So this is court directed, and there's no lawyers because the person has to admit the guilt in order to be referred for case conferencing. It's set up as like a mediative circle, if you like, but it's court directed. The person has admitted what they've done and they're accepting full responsibility. So there's no negotiation. You can't say accept responsibility for that bit, but not for this, because you went before the judge and you've said, well, actually, I have. So those cases can be referred to us. And quite often, the reason why we're involved in the mediation is because of the breakdown within the family or the family relationship, because of the action, okay, or because of the crime. And that's where we tend to be involved, or else we tend to be involved in a mediation if the young person returning back to their own community would be at physical risk of re-entering their community. That's going back to the exclusions that I mentioned earlier. So that's a very clear example where it comes through a court system. We're involved in the formal process, and then we take it externally after that. We did have a program that was funded whereby we had a worker who was who would have went to prisons and would have been involved in a mediation process with adjudicated offenders that were due to be released from prison, and we would have mediated them being reintegrated back into the community. Unfortunately, due to funding, that's actually been put on hold at the moment, and that came through the Department of Justice. As a community-based organisation, we do receive funding. So our head office, our core office in which I work in as operations manager, we receive funding from the Department of Justice. There are some other departments within our government that we get funded under. One will be Department for Communities, which is around community development and good relations, that kind of thing. And one specific department is under tackling paramilitarism, which is an extension of tackling the legacy issues here. And we are funded under that as well. In terms of, I'm going to say private legal practices, lawyers can refer cases into us. They can refer them in and say, look, I've got a situation here. I've suggested to my client that they could benefit from a mediative service. Would you like to be involved? And we can work on that, whatever it is. We have, for example, dealt with family members where a parent has passed away and they're contesting the will. And it's sort of brought about a split within the family. we're not getting into the detail about the will. It's the relationship building that we focus on. It's not to do with the legalities and the legal process that they're entering in, because we are not qualified and we're not covered to be giving them their legal advice. The only time that we would be given, I'm going to say legal advice, and I say that very loosely, would be around if somebody has particular bail conditions and we're trying to negotiate or get them involved in the mediation process. We have to be very mindful of that, just that we're not enabling them to break bail conditions, for example. Or if there is a legal agreement in place and we're still involved in the mediation process, certainly people can come and speak with us about the agreement and how best to maybe look at that. But that's literally just done with a freshman's eyes over it, to help. We are hoping to get to the position where our court service here are looking to focus particularly in terms of drugs and alcohol for some issues. And with that, we would be hoping that we would get direct referrals. There is a protocol in place where the police can directly refer a case. So a police officer, I phoned the police and said, somebody's broke into my house and they've stolen my laptop. And the police investigate and they find out actually that my ex-partner has stolen my laptop. So there's a bit of, there's some mitigating circumstances there that's tying me to the harmed part, or sorry, to the harmer. The police actually have it on their system that they can directly refer that case to us for a community-based restorative intervention. If they feel that going down a purely legal route actually would not benefit both parties. And they do take both parties into consideration, or if there's 3 parties, but they will look at that in the round and think, okay, there's a different way of doing this. An example actually I will give was a young person I worked with a number of years ago had a fallout with his parents. His parents went on holiday. He was 19. His parents went on holiday and he broke into the family home and he stole money. And I mean, it's on paper, you know, people would argue, well, he should be prosecuted. He was involved in criminal behaviour and he's harmed, etc., etc. But the police came just straight away and said, look, you know, if we send this back to you, would it be something you'd be interested in taking? And we said, absolutely. Number one, because I had the relationship already with the young person and the parents that I'd been working with. And 2, it really wouldn't have helped them in the long run had they completely, if that had went through our public prosecution service and they had went down that route, because sometimes you just can't reverse. When you're on that road, you just can't reverse. I'm not sure the way it works in the States, but it's for some crimes here, particularly in incidents of domestic violence, the victim in those cases actually doesn't have to give a statement to say that they want to prosecute or to continue with prosecution. It's enough that the police know that something has happened and they can take the case forward. That has been a big change in the law here in terms of DV cases and domestic abuse and coercive control. And a lot of police here will actually wear body cams. So if somebody phones in for something like that, more often than not now, police will attend with a body cam and they record the incident, or, you know, as soon as they get there, which means that if the victim then makes a statement and later withdraws, they've got body cam footage and they can still prosecute. Just while it's in my head, I'm going to make a point here about cases that we will not mediate in, because I think this is really important as well, actually. And I should have said this. We will not, at the minute, because this is open for debate and it is a bit of a difficult one for some people. But at present, we do not mediate where there's incidents of sexual abuse, violence, certain levels of coercion and control in terms of sexual exploitation, for example, and domestic violence. But we will probably most likely change our approach in terms of domestic violence. And And it's always been because of, just plain and simple, because of the power dynamic within those instances and those combinations. And we just haven't felt equipped to be able to enter those arenas. In terms of, actually, if we're talking about self-care for staff, it sort of dovetails this, because part of our ethos within the organisation is to make sure that every single person within the team, from the admin worker to the finance worker to the managers, the support workers, the youth workers, every single person has all of the relevant training, because you never know who you're picking the phone up to, who you're answering the phone. And if it's a finance officer, the finance officer's got to handle somebody on the phone and not go, oh, I can't deal with this, someone's crying down the phone or someone's really upset. You've got to be able to help people immediately. Doesn't mean that you're getting into a lot of the detail, but you've got to have the skills in terms of representing our organisation. And part of that self-care is making sure that staff have the requisite skills and resources that they can actually be the best practitioner that they can be. And we constantly provide refresher training. And I mean, we bring a lot of external agencies in as well, that have the expertise in different aspects of this work. So and we don't change our own practice overnight. So I'm going to say that from July last year, and most intensively from November last year, we've been working around domestic violence and coercive control, and how and when a mediative restorative intervention is appropriate. So we're starting to sort of change that cog now, and and the reason why we're changing, actually, it's going back to Walter's point about people aren't neutral. We're never neutral in a lot of things. But what we're having to do is we're actually having to sort of put ourselves, I suppose, outside the situation and think, if the parties involved think that this is an option for them, then we're facilitators. The outcome isn't for us, the outcome is for the participants who are involved in the process. So I'm not sure if you guys have very set boundaries in terms of cases that you will get involved in and cases that you won't get involved in, but we're transitioning in some of those areas. If we have cases, for example, and we think that there is anything in terms of sexual abuse or sexual harm, we refer those immediately. Okay, they are red flags for us. And that's another example. I'm not going to say breach of confidentiality, because it's a duty of care. And a duty of care to make sure that from a staff team, we have a duty of care to make sure our practitioners are protected, but also for the participants as well. Okay.
Okay.
And
I have a question.
sorry.
Yeah.
Hi, Belinda.
Do you work with kids that are having issues, like it could be gang related, it could be violence, it could be, hate crimes or something? Do you guys work with groups or just individual kids, or how do you?
Great question, thank you. We work with both.
Mm-hmm.
So we do targeted interventions with groups of young people, for example, and it's strange for us because the legacy of the conflict here, we wouldn't have talked in language around gangs and things like that, but it's become a lot more prevalent here. Mm-hmm. Because our conflict kind of took some of that away, for want of a better term. But most definitely now, I mean, gangs of young girls in school in particular, we've seen an increase in. They're weaponizing themselves. We've had lots of conversations in terms of, we would go into schools, quite a number of the schools that we would be involved in, we would be part of like a behavioural unit that the school would have. But we're going in, to try and reduce the level of suspensions or expulsions from school. But also, we don't want young people to be criminalised when they're so young and they're just making really silly decisions. And their decision-making skills are just, you know, that they're just off the scale. And quite often because some of them just don't have the capacity in order to be making positive decisions. So we do a lot of preventative work and a lot of interventions to sort of help map that out for them.
Right.
And I must say, we are very lucky here because the police here get a really hard time. Okay, I think the police everywhere can sometimes get a really hard time. But what I will say here is the emphasis and the steer is more towards preventing people actually from being involved in the criminal justice system, as opposed to trying to get them reined into it. And I know that for example, we've done some work with the police in Florida. We've done some work with Red Hook Community Court up in New York, and they would have a completely different experience. And they would say, Debbie, our police set out here to get as many people prosecuted as they possibly can. And here in Belfast, I work within really working class, marginalised communities here in the inner city areas. And the police, for the majority of them, that's not in their best interest.
Great. Good to hear.
I know, long may it last. Yeah, so I've touched a bit there in terms of the self-care stuff and the duty of care, but one of the things that we are really active in doing is facilitate restorative circles. Facilitate restorative circles amongst our team, and they can be thematic. So it could be a healing restorative circle, for example, where you bring certain members of the team together. If there's been a specific case that people have been working on, it's been quite hard-hitting. If there is an internal, I suppose, conflict, which happens, we've about 50 members of staff. Sometimes it's just good just to sit around and sort of have a chat and thrash some of those issues out. We use the restorative circles as part of self-care around, we'll practice mindfulness. I was mentioning earlier on about a colleague who worked with us, and she was from Texas. He was also a yoga teacher, so that worked out quite well for us. We're very lucky that we have an in-house counsellor as well, 2 counsellors that we have in-house, and then we have a lady who works remotely. So all staff have access to that, whether it be a soft light touch or whether it be something a lot more intensive. And we also have a gym as well at the back of the office that I work in. So people can go out and use the facilities there. So we're very active in terms of positively promoting self-care. But another key aspect of it is we have an open door policy. So we have direct lines right up to our director, Debbie Waters, and everybody in between. So we don't make it difficult for people to reach the top if they feel that they've got an issue or a concern and they need it sorted at a directorship level. The door's open. And some organisations find that quite strange because there is a glass ceiling there for some people and they can't navigate that. And with us, it's just a case of, we'll say, don't ever go to bed and feel like you've got the weight of something on your mind. Contact somebody, send a text message, phone call, whatever it is you need to do, just reach out. Okay. I'm just conscious of time. It's almost 7 p.m. here, but 2 minutes to 1 for you guys.
Are there any more questions?
Debbie, I'd like to ask.
Go ahead.
Debbie, I'd like to ask, what level of follow-up do you have? In other words, after you have a mediation, is there some type of follow-up you do, and for how long?
Yes, great question, Ron. Thank you very much. Absolutely. The follow-up actually can take longer than the initial process from we actually first meet people the whole way through. The follow-up process, for example, will be, if it seems to be like a low level, say neighbourhood dispute, for example, it will be a case of at the agreement stage, we will work out with them, when do they want us to come back to check in with them. Quite often it's just a weekly check-in for about 4 weeks, maybe 5 weeks afterwards. It'll just be a phone call. I'm quite good at going and visiting people and bringing some really nice biscuits or really nice fruit and just popping around and having a chat just to see how things are going. Or quite often people will just swing by the office again and call in, but we wouldn't leave it we wouldn't sort of, I suppose, close it completely unless we were given a good 5 or 6 weeks. Okay. If the case is more complicated than that and we have involved external agencies, we'll make sure that there will be multiple contacts per week. And that will go between, for example, myself and co-worker, myself and other external agencies. It depends on what level they've been brought into and on a need-to-know basis in terms of the information that we're sharing. But in particular, the parties that have been involved. If it's a hate crime case, for example, or it's a vulnerable person that has been very clearly harmed, I mean, I've done daily checks to people. We had a gentleman who was the victim of a burglary in his home, and his life just was completely upended by it. And I made sure I called in every evening. And we made the agreement that his mobility sometimes would have been a bit difficult for him. I used to just wrap the window, just to let him know I was there, and if he just needed anything. And sometimes he'd be shouted out, and that was enough. But it's important that when the agreement is made, we will follow that up to make sure that people are sticking to what they've agreed to. Quite often as well, sometimes we'll go back and say, look, is this part of the agreement working for you? Because if it's not, let's not have it. Okay, let's not have it. Do we need to tweak anything? It can be quite difficult sometimes when you're asking people as part of a process to put what they want down in an agreement. And then you know yourself, it's like 2 weeks down the line, you're thinking, yeah, what should I've asked for this? Forgot about that little bit. We can go back and amend that, not a bother, not a bother. So yeah, the follow-up aspect of it, in terms of making sure that everybody is happy and that we evaluate the process. And we're always good at, I will always say to people, please give constructive criticism back. Tell me what I can do differently. Please help me evolve my own practice and let me know what you were really happy with and the times that you thought, okay, because it helps us develop, it helps me learn, and it helps me develop as well.
Thank you, Debbie. Any other questions? And then we can wrap it up. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing with us your process and how it all works there. And I had some great takeaways from this. So
Good. Thank you so much. It has been an absolute pleasure. Look, it's
Thank
Phil
you.
nice to be here.
Okay.
So
And
interesting. Whoa.
I hope you
sorry.
come back sometime.
Yes.
Yeah, there's barely scratched the surface. So good.
I know,
Thank you.
absolutely.